The history of women in music was, up until recently, an untold story. When they were women, musicians, conductors, patrons, and composers did not appear in history books, nor were their works performed in concerts. They were not found in record shops either. Feminist musicology emerged, above all, to correct this deficiency. Its proposal is to make these women visible, to give sound to that silence. Soon afterwards, this line of thought broadened its field of analysis. The significance of these studies has been important, especially since the decade of the 80s.
We know that the music for theatre in the Spanish Golden Age was performed almost exclusively by women. And this is remarked on in footnotes in books. This reality has important implications from the musical point of view. That is, the music has certain characteristics due to being performed by women, and it also has repercussions from the sociological point of view, of what music was thought to be, and what the status of the musicians and musical actresses was. These issues are only put forward from the point of view of feminism. Feminism also deals with traditional problems in the history of music. For example, the relationship between the life of a composer and his or her work, or the social significance of music, or the moral problems that some works may have for displaying content that is offensive to women or any other social group. These issues are common in musicology, but feminist musicology gives new answers.
Feminist musicology is interested in topics that up until then were marginalized in studies about music. Women composers and performers, the feminine audience, female gender representations. But it has also implied a change of perspective in dealing with classic themes in music. It is not only a change in the object of study, but also a change of perspective and handling of matters previously dealt with. In the work Feminism and Music, the history of music professor Pilar Ramos Lopez develops an introduction to this proposal of analysis.
In any case, the fundamental idea in feminist musicology is to consider that gender, i.e., the socially constructed idea about the sexes, about what a woman is, or how a woman should be, or how a man should be, well, to consider that this issue of gender is a determining factor, as some musicologists think, or a relevant one, as some of us others think, when writing about history and when making history.
The feminism that these studies are based on is not that of the 50s, 60s and 70s, where the interest lay in women's liberation and equal opportunities for both sexes, a feminism marked by Simone de Beauvoir's line of thought. Nowadays, many people have criticized that stance, considering it proper to white American or European women, as they do not perceive it as representative of the majority of women.
Feminist musicology gathered force in the 80s, the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s. And at first followed the set ways of traditional musicology. Well, great women composers were searched for, let's say, with the interest placed on the compositions. Lately, since the 90s, we could say that there has been a second wave that sometimes superimposes the previous one. There are people doing musicology in what we could call the old way. But lately there have also been new interests, that is, not to focus only on composers or their works, but also on the way of transmitting it, on the performers, the teachers, the institutions. The image that has been transmitted of women in opera or in the actual compositions, on how women have been as an audience, or the reception that compositions written by women have had. These kinds of issues, that is, looking more at meanings and functions and not focusing so much on the relationship between the composer and his or her work.
Nowadays, many women musicologists, composers and performers are interested in rescuing several aspects of the task carried out by those women silenced throughout history.
Personally, in these last few years as a performer, I've become very interested in music created by women in the past, because it has been a silenced and silent voice, but it has always been there and serves precisely as a considerable foundation for the building growing strongly today. Because nowadays it is considered almost normal, or relatively normal, to be able to perform works of contemporary women composers, to be able to improvise, which I am very interested in, and nobody finds that strange. However, people are surprised when they listen to music composed by women, for example, in the 18th or 19th centuries, which is what I, as a performer, as a pianist, may play. There is real surprise. Some people have approached me to say, well, for example, this lady who composed music in the 19th century sounds like Chopin, or Mariana Martinez sounds like Mozart. This is logical, because they made the music of their time. They were completely integrated in their time. And I realize that this is what surprised people most, to be able to prove that there has been that silenced voice until the present. That's why I believe that it is one of the most attractive aspects, that we are truly supportive and grateful to those women, because in a way we are here thanks to their work.
Feminism has achieved important aims regarding the rescue and appreciation of women devoted to music. The job is far from done, but today women instrumentalists, performers and composers can make their voice heard more easily than in the past.
When I was 6 years old, a teacher friend of my father came to teach me music. And that man said to me, "This is an F." I would say, "No, it is a D." "This is an A." "No, it is a C." Then this man said to my father, "Listen, your daughter is a bit thick, isn't she? There is nothing to be done. She doesn't understand anything." Well, a few days later, another friend of the family came, who was a jazz artist. He played jazz. At home there was a piano, of course, and he started playing jazz, and I remained glued there the entire time that he was at the piano, listening to all the latest songs of that time. Beautiful songs. And well, I didn't move for anything. And the following morning I opened the lid of the piano, put my hands on the keys, and composed my first piece. Then my uncle, who was also a musician, took paper and pencil and said, "Let's see, play it again." And I played it, exactly the same. So then, as from that moment, I composed my first album, at the age of 6. It was as if some antenna had been connected to me. That's the only explanation that I find. And from that moment I have never stopped composing.
An outstanding literary work is Feminine Endings, Music, Gender and Sexuality by Susan McClary. The aims and the way of proceeding of this field of thought are exposed there.
In 1991, Susan McClary wrote Feminine Endings, a book that has had tremendous repercussions. It certainly was not the first feminist book, but its virulent tone, and especially the fact that it focused on canonical composers, specifically the fact that it made reference to Beethoven, had an enormous impact. Up until then, musicologists had remained indifferent, let's say, to feminist musicology, which dealt with women. And as the male musicologists were concerned with the great composers, and no women appeared among those in their books, they could leave them out. Feminist musicology was on the periphery and they occupied the center. But when this North American woman musicologist spoke about Beethoven and mixed Monteverdi and Madonna in the same book, dedicating an essay to Monteverdi and another to Madonna in the same book, this shook the foundations of musicology, and the book had a great impact all over the world.
The late incorporation of feminism in musicology implied a disadvantage, because it did not count on a tradition and a collection of studies about women comparable to those that existed in other disciplines like literature. Philosophically, feminist musicology came into being linked to postmodernist proposals.
Feminist musicology appeared quite a bit later than other feminist studies. It appeared much later than the feminist studies about literature or about anthropology. That means that it was practically born as a postmodernist concept, that is, it questioned the canon from the very start. That series of great composers who appeared from Haydn to Beethoven. They tried to question the canon, to question that hierarchy between great music, that is, the music of the great composers, and popular music, or music from other cultures. They tried to look for meanings, for issues such as audience reception, for matters like how our concepts of identity are related to sound, you see, and these are all issues which, to a large extent, stem from postmodernism.
The current situation of women dedicated to music is far from ideal, but the actual ones involved in the process emphasize that, as years go by, many of the prejudices tend to disappear.
Society has experienced huge changes. For example, some time ago I had a woman friend in Villanova who said, "Look, I'm the only woman who has been to university." But now, well, this was 70 or 80 years ago. And now it seems incredible, as a woman going to university is now a completely normal thing. Both in the composition and interpretation of music, I believe that now these prejudices are beginning to disappear. This may still seem surprising in certain points, especially from a physical perspective. For example, to be able to see a woman playing a trumpet. But by now there are very few instruments where we may consider this to still be surprising. We already have numerous examples of women playing all kinds of instruments, such as percussion, many wind instruments, and I find it is only surprising, as I was saying, perhaps in some wind instruments. As for the rest, the progress in composition has also been very important. I think things are moving ahead forcefully, and even in areas where I think this could still be manifested, it is almost inevitable that in a very short time the progress will carry on being equally fast.
However, For some specialists, the last 20 years have shown a general recession in social progress, which carries on affecting the situation that women had achieved in the field of music.
It seems to me that the real progress of women, and in the specific case of my work, which is composing, was definitely in the 50s, 60s and 70s, and now we are clearly going backwards in that field, as in so many others. I think we have lived through glorious moments in the recent past, and now we are moving backwards as far as social progress is concerned. And the access for women to traditionally male jobs is clearly in recession again.
In the Anglo-Saxon world, they talk about 3 waves of feminism. The first is that of the suffragettes, from the end of the 19th century until the decade of 1920. Then they were seeking a reform of the political system without questioning it. The second wave developed from the middle of the 60s until the middle of the 80s. This was the women's liberation movement. This wave was tied to civil rights movements and to a new left wing that challenged traditional values like family and marriage. The latest wave is the so-called cultural feminism, influenced by postmodernism and the gay and lesbian movements.
We can fit the gay and lesbian movements into feminist musicology. I don't think that is a separate kind of musicology. It is a very radical movement that contributes a lot of sense of humor and also a lot of insight when it comes to detecting cover-ups or some data falsification or facts in history books. But as I said, I don't think that it is a movement with a theoretical framework epistemologically different to that of feminist musicology.
Experts point out the field of composition as the most conflictive one for women, where they find most prejudice. And they already feel this when being trained in music conservatoires.
When I was studying at the Madrid Conservatoire, the truth is that women were destined to be performers, and that there were, in inverted commas, feminine instruments, or those that women had easier access to, because historically there had been precedents, because it is always the same. There are women who have come before us, and because there were many of them, they could not be silenced. This is the case of the piano. The fact that a woman could dedicate herself to playing the piano professionally was never questioned. The fact of composing was not questioned either. Dedicating yourself to it professionally was a different story. In any case, composition professors are still men, and what most women do is work in elementary teaching. And well, this is like at university, isn't it? Where the majority is also male, isn't it? This is something general. It is not an exception. We women composers are not an exception with regard to women mathematicians, women researchers. It is more of the same thing.
Popular music after the Second World War is a crucial theme for feminism. This kind of music is not simply an adolescent sentimental school. It also generates identities, perpetuating or criticizing the dominant gender ideas. It is a professional outlet for many women and a daily presence in most people's lives.
In the last few years, there has been a greater interest in women performers, artists, singers, and in the issues of meaning, reception and function. We could say that the main focus of interest is no longer on women composers, as it was in the early years, but more on issues of meaning, functions, identity, and audience reception. It has been a fundamental change.
As is expressed by the author in Feminism and Music, this line of thought offers new questions and new perspectives for old problems, and new doubts about things which, up to now, seemed obvious. Knowledge of this theoretical perspective is essential for any scholar in the field. Nowadays, a musicologist or a music historian can no longer limit themselves to knowing a few things about what is politically correct about feminist theory.